Okay, so it's the top of the hour, so we'll get started. Welcome to this, our 42nd CAQDAS webinar, I believe. My name is Christina Silva. I'm the director of the CAQDAS Networking Project, which is based in the Department of Sociology at the University of Surrey. And I'm here today with my colleague, Sarah Bulloch, who works closely with me. She's just saying hello there. I'll introduce her in a moment. She's going to be our speaker today. But before we get going with the main aim of the game today, I just wanted to remind you that we have a few training sessions coming up before Christmas. We have one in November around the use of digital tools for qualitative text analysis. We have one on using MAXQDA and one on NVivo. And you can see there the link. I'll just put the link into the chat as well if you want to go and grab that and have a look. So do check those out and do let us know if there are any particular training courses that you're interested in us providing. We try to be demand-led as much as possible, so we like to hear from you about what it is that you would find useful for us to put on. So keep in touch about training, but also keep in touch about webinars. So we've got another webinar coming up in November with David Williamson Schaffer, who is going to be talking about quantitative ethnography. I'll put the link into the registration for that one there if you're interested in that one. So do please come along. That's going to be at the same time as this on the 13th of November. And then we've also got a two-part symposium coming up at the end of November and in the beginning of December, which is going to be all about the use of AI in qualitative research. And we're hosting that one in partnership with the Social Research Association. So there's going to be lots of interesting discussions from developers of AI tools, methodologists about the implications of these developments, and also researchers using them. So if you're interested in that, I've put the third link in the chat is where you can find more information about that. It's not quite ready to register for that, but it will be available to register fairly soon, and that's also going to be free. Okay, so that's quite a lot that we've got going on, but as I say, always very interested to hear what would be useful for you for us to add to our schedule of webinars and training sessions. But let's get on to the session today. And it's really a pleasure of mine to formally introduce my very close colleague and friend, Dr. Sarah Bulloch, who's here with me today. She works with me at the CAQDAS Networking Project and actually runs most of our introductory workshops and also works closely with the Doctoral College at the University of Surrey, supporting those who are learning about qualitative methods as part of their studies. Sarah has a wealth of experience in doing qualitative and mixed methods analysis and supporting researchers to do the same. With a focus on the use of software CAQDAS packages to do so. But her expertise is not just in qualitative methods. She's actually got a quantitative background in the sense that her PhD was quantitative, looking at the relationship between trust and gender using complex statistical analyses using large population data sets. And she did her PhD in the sociology department here at the University of Surrey as well, which is when I first met her many years ago. After her PhD, Sarah left us and went to Southampton University, where she was involved in several projects using the Mass Observation Archive, which is an archive of narratives written voluntarily by members of the UK population. But Sarah doesn't only have experience of working in the academic sector. She's also worked in a variety of other sectors. For example, she's headed up a research for a large mental health charity, and various other activities before, luckily for me, she came back to the University of Surrey and joined me at the CAQDAS Networking Project. Sarah is also a senior associate at Qualitative Data Analysis Services, where, as well as teaching about and doing qualitative analysis, she also runs workshops in quantitative analysis and the use of statistical software. So if you're interested in those topics as well, then get in touch with Sarah. I'm sure she'd be happy to chat with you about those things. So on to the topic of today. In Sarah's work supporting researchers to use software for their analysis, she's observed a number of common challenges, and she's going to speak to one of those today, something that I know from my own work as well will resonate with many researchers. And that's about ensuring that the qualitative coding that we do when we use software, CAQDAS software, is focused on enabling us to do the analysis that we need to do later on. So thinking about how we can make the coding that we do enable us to accomplish our analytic needs. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Sarah. But just to remind you that please use the chat to ask questions or make comments. I will collate those along the way while Sarah is speaking, and then facilitate a discussion with her at the end. So there we go, Sarah. Thank you. Really much looking forward to this.
Thank you so much, Christina. Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for spending your time with us today. Looking forward to hearing what you think about what I've got to say. I will try and speak for no more than about 45 minutes and then leave us some time for discussion afterwards. And I welcome any comments that you've got. As Christina said, just pop them in the chat as we go along and we can talk about those when we get to the end. So what are we going to talk about together today? So coding with interrogation in mind. So the aim of the discussion today is to show, or to sort of illustrate, I guess, how widely available interrogation tools that we have access to in computer-assisted qualitative data analysis packages can afford us as researchers flexibility in our approach to coding. And it builds really on a webinar that Susanne Friese gave in 2021 for our webinar series, where Susanne spoke about some principles to bear in mind when we're structuring a coding schema. And thanks to Susanne for that, because it gave me the idea to build on that and try to take it a step further to look at some interrogation tools to match. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about what Susanne said in that webinar in a moment. The outcome of today, I'm really hoping that this conversation together will give you a sense of feeling more informed about how interrogation tools in CAQDAS, what they look like in those computer-assisted qualitative data analysis packages, feel more informed about them, and also to allow that to give us a sense of flexibility when it comes to designing the sets of codes that we want to put in place in line with whichever method of analysis we've chosen. Okay, and I also really hope that it gives a sense of excitement for you to go and have a look at some of those tools if you haven't already, and to try out some of the principles that we discussed today. So how are we going to get there? I'm going to start by thinking about some properties of research questions and research objectives, and also some properties of methods of analysis, because really when we're thinking about coding, we do need to go back to those real groundwork, if you like, those elements in order to inform our coding. So we'll start with that. And then we're going to have a look at how, as researchers of qualitative and mixed materials, we are in the business of searching for nuance and capturing nuance. And we'll talk a little bit about how that search for nuance can sometimes lead to certain consequences in relation to coding. And we'll have a little look at those. And they will then lead us on to thinking about, okay, well, how might we avoid some of those pitfalls, and specifically how interrogation tools in computer-assisted qualitative data analysis packages might allow for us to be a bit more flexible in how we set our codes up. Okay, you might come to the conclusion once we've finished that part that there may be some changes you'd like to make to a coding schema, and we'll talk a little bit about how that can happen, how packages enable you to allow your coding to evolve as you see fit. And we'll finish with a few short tips about developing an analysis plan that holds interrogation at the center, that plans for interrogation. Okay, let's start then with the first part. Properties of research objectives and research questions. Now, we will all be working to very different research objectives and research questions in any given project. And I've put on the right here a few different research questions and objectives for us to consider briefly. So they are completely unrelated to each other, drawn from different research projects. But let's look at them and consider some of the properties of these questions. So let's look at the first one. To what extent do clinicians and patients have similar conceptualizations of compassionate care? Okay, that's one question. An unrelated one, second one, how does parenting affect people's happiness? Then the third one is more of an objective, really, because of the way it's phrased, to explain the role of mentorship in women's career success. And finally, a question, in what ways do the narratives of those living with HIV challenge how disease management is represented in medical literature? So very different research questions and objectives sitting here. Let's consider some common features of these. Each of these research questions or objectives in some way seek to understand relationships between constructs. Okay, and the different constructs that we're working with of course, vary very much depending on our discipline and our topic. But mostly we can think about constructs as representing either factual characteristics associated with analytic units or representing ideas that are present in parts of the data. So let's look at the first research question. To what extent do clinicians and patients have similar conceptualizations of compassionate care? The idea of compassionate care, the construct of compassionate care, will be present in parts of the conversations that we have with clinicians and patients. Yeah, so that's a construct present in parts of the data. And the idea of whether someone is a clinician or a patient, that is representing a factual characteristic about those individuals as units of analysis in a study. Okay, now research questions and objectives have many more properties, of course, than just these. But these properties are particularly relevant in the context of this webinar because they are particularly relevant when it comes to both coding and interrogation. Okay, so we're going to come back to these as we go along. Let's also consider some properties of methods of analysis that are relevant when we're thinking about coding and interrogation. Most methods of analysis rely to some extent on coding. And of course, they do so in very different ways. But most methods will rely either to some extent on deductive coding or inductive coding, or both. Okay, so the way in which codes originate may be different based on the method, in relation to whether they originate deductively or inductively. And we'll come back to that idea in a moment when we consider coding and interrogation. What codes seek to do in any given method, of course, varies enormously based on the method. Yeah, and what job you give a code in any given method can vary enormously. Now, this next slide can be a little overwhelming, but if you're interested in exploring a little bit more how the job of codes can look very different in different contexts, you might like to consider looking at Johnny Saldanha's work on coding, specifically the Coding Manual for Qualitative Researchers, in which Johnny Saldanha opens up the idea that codes can be effective in the work that they do. They can be exploratory, procedural, elemental, grammatical, etc. So if you're interested in that as an idea and trying to uncover a little bit more about the work that codes do in any given context, do have a little look at Johnny Saldanha's work. But one thing is for sure, as qualitative researchers, we are, regardless of the project, in some sense searching for nuance. One thing that our codes are seeking to do is capture nuance in some way. And this nuance can be captured either deductively or inductively, or both. Yes, so if you're working deductively from certain ideas that are coming from the literature, from hypotheses that you'd like to test, nuance can be captured by you setting out all of the different aspects of a theory that you'd like to test in a nuanced manner, or all of the different categories and subcategories or dimensions of categories that you're looking for deductively. So a deductive coding approach can really be seeking nuance, as inductive coding approaches can too, where we might create lots and lots and lots of codes trying to capture the ways in which things are happening slightly differently in different contexts. Now, how we operationalize nuance in our coding when we're creating our code books, our coding schema, can differ depending on our preference and on our method. Sometimes we choose hierarchy in our coding schema to do that, and other times we might choose not to. So just to visualize a few examples of hierarchical and non-hierarchical coding schema, and using some CAQDAS packages to do that, we can see here a flat coding schema as operationalized in ATLAS.ti, where all of the little green diamonds represent codes, and we are not seeing them organized in a structural hierarchy. There may be structure in the ideas, but they're not operationalized in a structural hierarchy. Of course, it's possible to hierarchically structure them in ATLAS.ti as well, if you like, but you don't have to. Similarly, here we see in MAXQDA a hierarchical coding schema, where we have top-level codes like the work-life balance, work situation, wishes for the future, and sitting underneath those we have subcodes. So we're seeing nuance captured with and without hierarchy in list-based coding schemas. We also, of course, have computer-assisted qualitative data analysis packages that don't work primarily in a list-based way. And Quirkos is one of those, where the workspace allows us to organize our codes visually in this workspace. And each of these circles is a code, or in Quirkos, we refer to them as quirks. And these here are organized in a non-hierarchical way, whilst we can, if we want to, organize them hierarchically by connecting those quirks visually in the workspace. And in Quirkos, we can also choose, if we prefer, to visualize hierarchies in a more list-based way, as seen on the right there. So nuance, as we've seen here, can be captured using hierarchy or without hierarchy. Let's think a little bit further in relation to how we operationalize nuance beyond the hierarchical. Well, our options for capturing nuance really vary greatly based on the tools that we want to use. And of course, the tools available to us when we're working in a software package are quite different to those when we're working manually. And one of the ways in which they differ most, in my opinion, is to do with the presence of tools in digital packages for the analysis of qualitative materials, tools specifically designed for interrogation. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at together now. Now, as I wanted to explore with you, there has already been a discussion around coding in relation to the webinar series that we are speaking to today. Susanne Friese in 2021 gave a webinar entitled Building a Code System for Computer-Assisted Qualitative Data Analysis. And perhaps Christina can share in the chat a link to that webinar. Susanne covers an enormous amount of ground in that webinar, and please do have a look at it if you're thinking about options for how to structure code systems and how to build code systems. She provides some really useful tips and tricks and guidance around what to do, but she also provides us with some common pitfalls in relation to structuring coding schema. Let's look at a few of these now before we delve into how interrogation tools can really help us to avoid some pitfalls. So this is a screenshot taken from Susanne's webinar, where she showed a coding schema which could have been operationalized in any CAQDAS package. It happens to be operationalized in ATLAS.ti here. But what we see here, because this is just a small extract of this code system, is actually an extract of a much longer list of codes, a list that has become, for the researcher, overwhelmingly long and is unsorted. Okay, and this pitfall, which can happen fairly easily in computer-assisted qualitative data analysis packages, this sort of a long, overwhelming list can lead to researchers giving up on the software, printing out their coded data and trying to make sense of it in printed form. So that's one of the pitfalls Susanne spoke about, and we'll talk a little bit more about how interrogation tools can help us in relation to that in a moment. Another pitfall Susanne mentioned is issue around the duplication of codes. So what we see here in MAXQDA is a code schema which is designed to explore work-life balance. And in the project, the researchers are interested in how fathers and mothers deal with work-life balance. And if you can see, under the top-level code work-life balance on the left, we have a code for father, and a bit further down at that same second level, we have a code for mother. Because the researcher has sought to distinguish between discussions from fathers and mothers. Now, fathers and mothers talk about work-life balance in relation to some fairly similar issues. If you look one step further down in the code schema, you can see that under father and under mother, the next level down, we have similar topics: work-life separation, as conceptualized as successful and not successful. Those codes are sitting both under the father and under the mother code. Free time and self-care also sit under both the father and the mother code. And if you can see, what's happening there is a duplication of codes of subcodes across different categories. And what that means is we end up with an enormously long list of codes, a huge number of codes. Okay, when we're duplicating codes across different categories like this. And we can also end up with very deep hierarchies because we might seek to show relationships between some codes and other codes, relationships that exist in our minds. We might seek to show those in the coding schema. Additionally, what we might end up with is actually very little coded to each of the codes. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. A third pitfall that Susanna mentions is to do with the idea of a hierarchy containing a mix of topics. So we see the local knowledge code as having a subcode to economy. And under economy, we have lots of different elements. But these are not elements of the economy as much as they are ideas that are linked to economy. And what the researcher is trying to do here again is to show links that are existing in the researcher's mind between agriculture and economy. The researcher is trying to show those links in the coding schema. Yeah? Now, we'll see in a minute how interrogation tools are really designed to allow us to avoid this sort of situation, which can get really overwhelming very quickly. Susanna says in her webinar that a more effective code schema, looking at exactly the same sort of ideas as depicted on the left, a more effective code schema for those ideas might be the one presented on the right. And we're going to look at why that is in a moment. So Susanna's webinar points to lots and lots of things to take away, to think about when we come to coding. And the ones that are particularly relevant to us today are to do with not mixing topics that don't belong under the same subtree. Yeah. And trying not to show the linkages between the concepts of interest in our minds in our coding schema. Okay. To be explicit, the reason we can suggest these tips is because, unlike in manual working in qualitative data analysis, when we're working manually with materials, when we have packages like the ones we've just looked at and many, many more, we have access to interrogation tools that allow us to work with our codes differently. I'm going to show you 4 different illustrations of how interrogation tools in these packages, specifically interrogation tools designed to capture intersection, might affect your coding practices. Okay, so the first of these illustrations, the first tip, is to do with allowing codes to overlap in a given set of text. Okay, and here, as trainers in these packages, one thing that I have seen many, many times is that we might find people trying to capture nuance, not by allowing codes to overlap, but rather by making new codes. So let's have a look. Imagine we see someone talking in our data, we see our respondents talking about family. We might make a family code and code to that. And then we find that that person is talking positively about family, and we're excited by that nuance, and we want to capture that nuance in the way that they're talking about family. We may be tempted to create this subcode for positive talk. That sits under the family code. Then we may be tempted to create an additional subcode under family that also captures negative talk about family. So far, so good. However, when we find material where people are talking about their friends, and we find that they're talking about their friends positively and negatively as well, we would end up making those subcodes of positive and negative talk sitting under the friends code too. And that would happen with every category, leading to duplication of subcodes, as discussed by Susanna in her webinar. What would we suggest we do instead? So what you could do instead is to create the codes for family, friends, and school, but recognize that the idea of positive and negative talk is an idea in and of itself. So we create a separate attitude code, sit with the subcodes of positive and negative sitting underneath it. How do we use this coding schema? Let's be explicit. When we find a piece of data which is about family, it gets coded to the family code. If that piece of data is also positively speaking about family, we also code that piece of data to the positive code. We allow our codes to overlap, which is not what we would be doing if we were working as we see in blue on this slide. Okay, now what we often get asked when we introduce this idea of overlapping codes to people, when they first meet digital tools for the analysis of qualitative data, is, Sarah, how am I going to get at the material that's positive about friends now? How do I capture that nuance? This is where the interrogation tools come in. There are interrogation tools designed specifically to look for co-occurrence of codes. Okay, and we're going to look at some examples of these just now. If we code, as we see in orange here, what we're doing is capturing nuance by allowing codes to overlap on a given set of data, rather than by creating new codes. So we end up with fewer codes in our code schema, less likely to end up with a massively overwhelming long list of codes. Okay. We also find that if we're working like we see in orange, that our codes are substantively simpler, cognitively easier to use. It's easier to place a segment of data in any given code because the code is substantively simpler. The complexity is arrived at by intersection of codes in that piece of data. Yeah, allowing those codes to overlap. In relation to hierarchy, what are we taking away here then? Hierarchy is not wrong, yeah, but it can be a sign that you have forgotten that codes can overlap. It can be a sign that you are creating new codes to capture nuance rather than allowing them to overlap. Let's have a look at some of the co-occurrence interrogation tools in some packages. So in NVivo here, we have some codes on the left-hand side. We have some codes sitting under economy. So we have the agriculture code, the jobs code, and the tourism code sitting there. And above it, above those codes, we have a code for attitude, which organizes mixed, neutral, negative, and positive attitudes. Now, if we use that code schema, as we saw in orange in the previous slide, if any time agriculture is discussed negatively, we code that piece of data to both the agriculture code and the negative code. If we allow the codes to overlap, we can, in NVivo, ask for a matrix coding query, which looks a little like this. We have a table that is created with the agriculture, job, and tourism code in the rows, the mixed, negative, neutral, and positive codes in the columns. And in the cells, we have access to the intersection of those codes. Now, that table can be visualized in a variety of different ways. We see it, and there's a table here. In NVivo, we can also visualize it as a chart. Okay. Note that this is an and matrix. It's looking at where material is coded to the cost, the jobs code, and the negative code. We could change it to a or, not, near, preceding, surrounding interrogation. So we're not just looking at the co-occurrence in the relation to an and operator, but we can also go slightly more in depth if we wanted if we had different needs. How do we access the negative talk about jobs then? When we double click on that intersection, that's 20 in that cell, it will open, the package will open for us all of the data we had coded to both the jobs and the negative code. So the cells are windows into the data coded to both codes. Let's have a look at this in another package. In ATLAS.ti, the code co-occurrence table can access intersection. We have our codes selected on the left-hand side. We select what goes in the rows and what goes in the columns. And then in the middle of the screenshot, we see the intersections visualized in two ways. At the top, we have a little table, as seen also in the previous package. But underneath that, we have it seen as a Sankey diagram. And you can also visualize it in ATLAS.ti as a bar chart. To get at the qualitative data at the intersection, again, we just select that cell and it will open up for us the quotations coded to the intersection of those codes. And we can access the data in its original context by double clicking on those quotations and see it there. So I hope that you can now visualize how allowing codes to overlap on any given segment of data can really allow us to get at nuance because of the interrogation tools that we have access to. And that therefore those interrogation tools might inform how you go about structuring your code system. Let's have a look at another example of how the interrogation tools in the packages we have available to us today as a researcher community can affect coding. We might be in a situation where we had a structured interview, such as what we see here, where we have question 1, 2, and 3 asked of multiple participants. And we might like to compare what participants say in answer to question 1, let's say. Now, thanks to interrogation tools, we can code for those questions. You could code everyone's answer to question 1 to a question 1 code, the same for question 2 and question 3. Now, how can you go about comparing what people said to question 1, 2, and 3? Well, again, co-occurrence interrogation tools can help us to do that. Having coded to the questions, we can see how they intersect either with participants' transcripts or with other codes. So looking at how they intersect with participant transcripts, here in MAXQDA, our code matrix browser sees on the left-hand side in the rows the question codes. And along the top in the columns, we have the participant transcripts, respondents 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And we can see at the intersections of these that we have access to the data. By clicking on the cells, we can then see what respondent 2 said in answer to any given question, and then compare that with respondent 3, 4, etc. By clicking on the selected data, it gives us to that data in the original context in the transcript. The same is true if you wanted to look at how particular themes, how particular codes occur in given questions in your transcript. So we can have a look in a code relations browser in MAXQDA at the intersection of question codes and more thematic codes. And we can visualize that in a variety of ways in MAXQDA. Clicking on any intersection and any cell, again, the data from that question coded to a specific conceptual code can be accessed. We can see the same happening in deduce here. Bottom left of our code book, we have question codes that have been created that could then be used in a code co-occurrence, where we have along the rows here the question codes, and along the top in the columns, more thematic codes. And again, we can access by looking at any intersection the data coded to that intersection. So I hope that you can see that these interrogation tools allow you to use codes not just for thematic purposes, but also for structural purposes, to capture structure in the data that is relevant to answering your research question. The third tip I wanted to point to is that interrogation tools that are available in the majority of packages to date mean that we don't always have to capture factual features, factual characteristics about our materials using codes. So factual materials include sociodemographics about participants, metadata about articles, properties of documents. Most packages have specific ways of assigning factual features to these units of analysis. And how can we make use of those characteristics once we've assigned them to the materials? Well, surprise, surprise, our co-occurrence interrogation tools can help us to do that. Let's have a look at some examples. Here we see in QDA Miner a project about speeches, political speeches from a number of different candidates. And these speeches have certain properties. These properties can be captured in QDA Miner using what QDA Miner calls variables. So on the right-hand side here, you can see the variables associated with each speech, such as who gave the speech, so which candidate, what the speech topic was about, whether it was about foreign policy, whether it's an announcement, etc., as well as the party that that candidate associates with. So these are not codes assigning those facts to the materials, but rather in QDA Miner variables. Okay, let's have a look at how they're used in interrogation tools. So here we see in a coding by variable interrogation, the codes down the left-hand side, the more thematic codes in the project, and across the top in the columns, the variable categories, Republicans versus Democrats. And again, we can see that the materials there can be visualized, the intersections can be visualized in a variety of ways. The final tip I wanted to give around how interrogation tools can affect how we code is to do with the fact that interrogation tools afford us the opportunity to only create one set of conceptual codes. You don't need multiple sets of the same codes in order to compare groups of data. So, for example, if we're wanting to explore how those living with HIV speak about the way they manage living with HIV as compared to how the literature speaks about disease management, how do we compare across those two data types? Well, we create a single code for disease management, which is applied, yes, coded to the literature. So we code the segments of the literature or the segments of where we've written about our literature. We code that to the disease management code. But that disease management code, that same code, is then used in the transcripts from the participants to explore how they speak about it. But if I have this single set of codes, then, Sarah, how do I compare what my literature and my participants say about disease management? Again, this is the role of the interrogation tools in CAQDAS packages. They will allow us to explore, so compare what participants said as compared to what the literature says about a particular topic, to see the extent to which our participants are bringing new ideas that the literature doesn't contain, and where the literature contains things that are not present in the narratives of participants. Let's visualize this in a couple of packages. So here we have in MAXQDA document variables, which assign factual characteristics to our materials. One of them is the variable data type, which is assigned to each document in the project. And we can see that here. And it is then possible to use this document variable in an interrogation. In this instance, a qual themes by variables interrogation in MAXQDA, where we can select a given code, in this instance, the employment code on the left there, and see how that employment code is used in the first column, the interview data, the second column, the literature data, and the third column, the survey data, allowing us to compare and contrast across different data types. Let me summarize what I've been saying so far before I finish up. In summary, because of co-occurrence interrogation tools available to us in CAQDAS packages at the moment, we can capture nuance by allowing codes to overlap in a given segment of data, rather than by creating new codes. Okay. Because of co-occurrence interrogation tools in CAQDAS packages, we can choose to use codes to represent structure in our data, such as repeated questions. And these can then be explored in an interrogation in relation to different themes. Because of co-occurrence interrogation tools in CAQDAS packages, we don't necessarily have to capture factual characteristics of our data using codes. We can often do that using other mechanisms, such as variables that we have seen in the examples provided. Different packages call them slightly different things, but they are available in many of the packages. Finally, because of co-occurrence interrogation tools, it is possible to work with one single set of conceptual codes and allow them to cut across all of our data types. We can then explore how each data type speaks about particular topics because of these interrogation tools. Now, it is worth saying that co-occurrence tools that I have talked about today are only a subset of interrogation tools in computer-assisted qualitative data analysis packages around today. There are other interrogation tools that are not designed to capture co-occurrence, okay, that I have not spoken about today. But I've spoken about co-occurrence tools today because knowledge of these can have a particularly profound effect on your coding. And that's why I've focused on them today. What if you've changed your mind about how you want your codes to look now? Well, we often change our minds about how we want our codes to look because our thinking evolves all the time. And developers of packages have taken this into consideration. You will find ways of working with your existing codes to change them without having to start again. You will be able to rename codes, copy codes, paste codes, delete codes, merge codes, aggregate codes, subdivide codes, so that your coding schema can evolve as your ideas do. So we can always turn what we see on the left here into what is on the right here without starting again by using actions like copy, paste, delete, merge, aggregate, etc. Final thing I wanted to say. It is clear that knowing about interrogation tools at the start of an analysis has distinct benefits because it will affect how you begin coding. So if we look at the existing research questions we spoke about at the beginning, the way you might go about coding in these 4 research questions will be very different if you're aware of interrogation tools from the outset. What would I suggest you do when you start off a project? Look at your research questions, look at your objectives, identify what are the concepts of interest in my questions, in my objectives. Ask yourself, how will I represent these in the software? Will I use codes for that? Will I use other components available in the software to represent these concepts? And given that, which interrogation tools do I think can help me explore how these concepts are related to each other? Now, there are many, many different ways of working to plan for an analysis in this way. Lots of different ways in which you could do that and how you could set about answering these questions for yourself. But the 5-level QDA pedagogy developed by Wolf and Silver does provide some guidance tools and some planning tools that can be helpful for this. So you might like to have a look at some of the resources on the website around those. I am going to stop talking now and open up the discussion part of the webinar. Thank you so much for listening, and it'd be lovely to hear thoughts, comments, questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'll get started whilst we wait for some questions to come up in the chat if anybody has them. But thank you very much for that presentation, which I thought really clearly illustrated the value of interrogation tools. In particular, really helpful that you showed us several ways in which they can act as levers to uncover the relationships between the constructs that we've got embedded in our research objectives and the questions. So that was really concrete and really clearly expressed. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
You suggested that knowing about these interrogation tools early on, for example, when we begin planning for doing our coding, is really important. That came across very strongly. And the practical examples that you gave were really powerful, I thought, and concrete for that as well. But I was just wondering, before we see if there are any other questions from others, I know you talk about these interrogation tools when you teach these packages, when you introduce researchers to coding and software. But I'm just wondering do you think not being aware of the interrogation tools at an early stage, is that the main or the only reason why researchers sometimes get into the problems that Susanna Frieser expanded on in her webinar? Or do you think there are other things going on there sometimes that explain why some of those issues happen? You've kind of focused on what the solution might be, but I'm just wondering if there are some other reasons why that might happen, as well as not being aware of the interrogation tools, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, our minds are all different. We start in different places when we begin an analysis. And one of the beautiful things about these digital tools that we have at our disposal these days is that they are designed to be flexible spaces for us to represent our thinking as it stands at any moment in time. So it's completely normal for the initial part of coding to reflect those initial thoughts. So it depends on method as to what those initial thoughts might look like. If you're starting very deductively, then your initial thoughts might be very structured in as they are represented in the coding system. But you might also find yourself, if you're working in that space, trying to represent those relationships between those ideas very early on, because you're wanting to communicate those to someone else consuming your work. So it's absolutely natural that our code systems start out look very different one from the other, because we start in different places, I think, based on method, based also on our experience of analyzing qualitative data, based on the extent to which we want to be really inductive, because lots of very inductive approaches explicitly ask us to really be open to creating lots and lots of codes initially, don't they? So it can be something that actually is a product of method, which we then reflect on and say, okay, actually, let's think about how, having done that bit, I can turn it into something that allows me to move on with my analysis.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think I've sometimes observed that it's maybe sometimes also to do with personal preference as well as the method side of things, or maybe researchers who work in teams often start off a little bit more structured than you might do if you were working in an individual. So there's lots of different ways of working. I suppose that's why the fact you can change your mind is great, isn't it? In terms of flexibility. Yeah. Great. I can see there's a question in the chat from one of our participants. So Sarah says, do all packages contain the same interrogation tools? How would you go about choosing the right package for your requirements?
Yeah, really good question, Sarah. I would say that the vast majority of packages will contain interrogation tools that allow you to explore co-occurrence. The exact way in which they do that can differ very slightly from one package to another. But the majority of the examples I've given today can be operationalized in any package. Now, if you want to choose between packages, I would say that there are ways of doing that. Some of them are based on access to packages. But if you'd like a little bit more information about individual packages, we can point you to some places to go and have a look at some comparisons there. But I would say that you are in good hands, because the developers across the board know that we need these tools as researchers. So we are equipped with them in the vast majority of instances to look at co-occurrence. Yeah.
Fab. I'm just putting in the chat the link to the page on our website, Sarah, where we've got those choosing files, which are kind of reviews of, I think we've got 14 or 15 different qualitative software programs up there now. So that might be a good starting point. There's also a couple of webinars that have spoken to that issue. One around software generally, and another one around free tools. So if you're interested in exploring free tools, then have a look at the webinars as well.
Absolutely. Can I say one more thing? If people are interested in playing with these tools, if you're kind of new to this idea, I would really recommend not leaving the playing with the tools till after you've finished all your coding. We often say this, don't we, Christina, when we're talking to people, try to make friends with the tools as early as possible, because as you can see, if you're planning to use them to explore nuance and to explore co-occurrence, you really need to know that what's at that intersection when you open it up is enough for you to interpret what you need to interpret. So it's not a great idea to code and code and code for months on end, hoping, crossing your fingers that the interrogation tool will allow you to see what you want. Why not code a little bit of data? Maybe 2 or 3 transcripts, code them up fully using whichever analytic method you're using, trial that whole analytic arc, and then run the interrogation on just those. And see that your interrogation is going to allow you to access the level of interpretation you need. If it does, amazing, then you've been coding in a way that allows that intersection to be coming through really fruitfully. If when you open those cells in whatever package you're using, you're not seeing that enough material there to interpret what you want, then that probably means you need to think about how you've been coding a bit and maybe adjust that a bit. And it's good to know that earlier rather than later.
I totally agree with that. There's 2 things that strike me when you say that. One is that what you're talking about, Sarah, is about piloting your analysis, isn't it? So we're very much always thinking about piloting our qualitative data collection instruments. Like we'll come up with an interview guide and we'll try it out and see whether the questions or the discussions we might have give us the kinds of information we need. But it's less common to kind of pilot that whole qualitative research arc, as you called it. But that's really, really good advice. And then one other thing I'll just finish up with, which relates to that, is asking questions that you know the answer to already using the interrogation tools. I've also found to be really useful, because if I know what I expect to find when I run one of these interrogations, and then I get what I expect to find, then I can feel that I can relax into the knowledge that I'm using the tools in the way that's going to achieve what I want.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's useful as well. I think we've come to the end of our time, but there's lots of thank yous going on in the chat, which is great.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks for sharing your time with us.
Absolutely.
The recording of this webinar will be made available to everybody here, so we will let you know when that's up, and do share it with anyone else that you think would benefit from that. Yes, and hope to see you at another one of our webinars soon.
Yeah, we look forward to seeing you at our other sessions, and do keep in touch. We're happy to help with any follow-up questions if anybody has them. But for now, thank you very much.
Have a lovely rest of your day.